Guess what? It's 4:15 p.m. on July 14th, 2026. It's been a little while since we had a board meeting, 3 weeks, I think, between this one. But here we are, and we are in session. And the first topic, I see a whole lot of water people out there. Hey, guys, thanks for the tour. Tours and education and everything. So, water rate study, and we'll start with Jackie.
Good afternoon. Happy to be here. We have Sean Gaddy from AE2S with us. He's our rate consultant. He's client leader and director with AE2S and expert in funding and rates. Before I turn it over to Sean to go through some of the preliminary findings from the rate, I do want to talk a little bit about public outreach. Right now, our public outreach plan for the rate study is to build on what we did with the master plan. So continue the public meetings, continue the special presentations for different groups like the Rotary and the Realtors and so forth. We have a rather robust website we're rebuilding that will have a lot of links to more information on the website. And then we have a bunch more videos like the one we showed you in the last presentation that we're going to be gearing up toward release to the public. We do want to keep flexible in that in our approach to the public outreach and want to do more of those newspaper articles and so forth too to get the education out there. You may have seen a bill stuffer. We're planning to use that venue as well, and then short messaging too. So working with Kate, the public information officer, and an outside consultant to develop some more robust content. And then flexible in that if we hear feedback from the public on what they want to hear or what they're not hearing, then we can pivot and adjust with our outreach for the public on the rates. This is the part where we thought we'd start getting more interest because we didn't get a lot of interest in the master plan, but now as we start talking about the rates, we suspect there will be a lot more interest from the public. So I'm going to ask Sean to come up and run through this stuff. This is based on the 2026 budget. Now keep in mind we don't have final numbers for 2026 and we also are still waiting on final 2025, so things may change a little bit. So right now we're based on best information available. This is what we're finding for the rates. So, Sean?
Thank you, Jackie. Good afternoon, Mayor and Trustees. As Jackie mentioned, my name is Sean Gaddy. I am a consultant with AE2S. The one thing she did forget to mention about my past is I have worked with the town of Estes Park before. I was the project manager for your previous rate study that was completed in 2019. I think it was 2019. So I do have a past working relationship with Trustee Eshelman and that work. Also helped the town in the 2021-2022 timeframe negotiate the contract and rates with the YMCA. So I'm familiar with the town's history when it comes to water rates and much of the planning you've been doing. And we've been talking about a lot of this planning since back then. Unfortunately, sometimes when you're talking really big costs and implementing really big projects, things don't necessarily move always really quickly. So working on many of the same decisions and discussions, and look forward to conversation here this afternoon. Feel free by all means for it to be a conversation if you have any questions. As Jackie mentioned, I understand you like these sessions to be conversational, so feel free to interrupt me at any time and ask any question as we're going through this. Just a quick background. Jackie did just mention the master plan. Obviously, the master plan is driving big needs as we consider looking at implementing rather significant capital improvement projects. We'll talk a little bit about what that looks like in the form of how we work those into our revenue requirement projections of the study, and what we also look at within the study related to corresponding operating budgets and the increases in expense and revenue requirements that go along with that. So lots of costs to consider, how we consider those costs in terms of escalation factors, how we look at funding projects either with cash funded capital or debt service within the rate models are all things that we'll walk through. In addition to that, I also want to talk a little bit about regional comparisons and some of the preliminary considerations. If you notice on the title slide, this is what we call the phase one part of the rate study process. So we'll talk a little bit about what do we mean by phase two and beyond in the form of next steps. Previous work, as mentioned, I did assist back in 2019 with the rate study and the 3-year rate schedule that was implemented at that time. There has not been an increase since that time in 2022. There is the 2016 tap fee schedule that has not been adjusted since that was adopted. Did, again, like I mentioned, help with the YMCA agreement and the contract and rates that were ultimately established in that process. And then obviously the really big thing we're looking at right now from a foundational standpoint is the implementation of the water master plan. So all of those create future challenges that we need to look at as far as inflation and future costs and implementing those system improvements in a system in Estes that doesn't have the benefit of a whole lot of growth. The overall customer base of the water system is relatively static year over year, which growth creates challenges, but no growth also creates challenges when you're looking at implementing a study like this. So the objectives overall, obviously we're looking for reliable utility operations, looking to implement a sustainable plan. The water master plan implementation is clearly a huge objective of the study, and when we're all done, we want to make sure the rates that we do establish from a cost of service standpoint are considered fair, equitable, and in line of the cost of service being driven by each of the customer classes that you do serve. The big why is the master plan. Over the last few months, I understand you have had a couple of study sessions on the master plan overall, looking at the projects that were recommended, everything from the elephant in the room, which is the new water treatment plant project and how large that will ultimately become, but the number of other improvements in terms of storage in the system, the pipe network of the system, pump stations, et cetera, are all very key things that are being looked at. We do know cost ranges at this point as far as what implementation of many of those improvements will look like, but obviously many of the improvements are not final designed at this point with bid costs to consider. And so when we do a study like this, we do want to try and understand that range of potential future cost and try and understand, how to plan for that variability and create flexibility in the plans as well. So to the phase one and beyond aspects of the study scope, the big piece of what we are looking at right now in phase one is what I would call a revenue requirements and revenue adequacy evaluation. So we're looking at the operational expenses, the administrative expenses, the capital expenses of the utility. We're forecasting those forward in a model in order to determine, as Jackie mentioned, where are we at today with the 2026 budget? How do we expect that budget to have to grow over time as you look at the escalation of costs across those various different aspects of the budget moving forward? And how do we develop a rate revenue adjustment recommendation broadly that can meet those revenue requirements into the future? Phase one is not a detailed rate design study, meaning that we are truly looking at the revenue needs of the system moving forward. Phase two, what we would intend to do if we are on the right track as far as total revenue requirement increases necessary to fund the plan, we would look to dial in how we exactly design rates to meet that, specifically from a cost of service standpoint. So when you look at tap fees, when you look at rate revenue by the classes served, your residential and non-residential classes, what specifically are we looking to dial in, and are each of those classes and revenues that are contributing the appropriate amount moving forward? So that is a future phase. As Jackie also mentioned, we are looking at large costs. Right now, I would say we're looking at fully loaded costs within the study. That does not mean that work will not continue from a funding standpoint to look at grant offsets, potential loan forgiveness type of offsets in those major projects. But right now, we're planning for the worst, and we'll work to make that better as time progresses with the implementation of the rates over time. So at this time, what is known? Obviously, we know that since 2022, rates have not been increased, and so we maybe are a little bit behind the eight ball in that regard as far as just keeping up with the inflationary aspects of running a water utility. The capital needs that are identified in the master plan are significant, and because of that, we will need to increase revenue of the utility, whether those costs track more on the lower end of the ranges that are included to the master plan or the higher end. regardless, revenue increases are going to be necessary given where we're currently at with the utility. What we don't know, as I mentioned, is all of the final details. Projects haven't, like I said, been designed, they haven't been bid, final costs are not in place, and so we're working to build a model that gives us the ability to, like I said, adjust as we go in looking at the implementation of different rate increases over time. So what we've built to this point really, in order to address the uncertainty, is a model with the flexibility to, I'll say, pivot. We have the ranges of costs. We have consideration from a capital standpoint, the high low, as I mentioned. We have inflationary assumptions built into the model over time. And like I mentioned, what we know is we need to start somewhere. We know that where we start and what we project over the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years is probably not going to be perfect. So we want to have the ability to pivot as circumstances change. And so we are really modeling, like I mentioned, scenarios to try and dial in where do we start, where do we potentially go after we start, and how do we land long-term within the overall rate projections of the system. So we are looking right now, largely from a capital variation standpoint, a $40 to $50 million delta, dependent upon all of the final details that, like I said, as projects are bid, as projects are sized, and finality, as potential outside funding sources come into play for the capital. And so we are really building the model to address, like I said, that range of variability. What you'll see in a moment in our presentation is we're looking at building out an initial increase strategy for the first few years of the study time frame as a primary implementation, and then thoughts towards secondary implementation in another 3-year period that could either continue if costs continue to increase on the higher level of the scale, or like I said, we could pivot down to a lower level of the scale and adjust at that time. Building the model overall, as Jackie mentioned, built from the get-go off of your budget. So we had your 2026 budget, looking at your revenue, your expenses, your cash balances, what you plan to, like I said, fund from a capital and debt service standpoint for the things that were currently included. We built off of that and the revenue requirements of 2026 to forecast forward. There are things as we look into the future years' revenue requirements, as we get into potentially operating a new greenfield water treatment plant. Obviously, the status quo when it comes to operating expenses is probably not going to stay static at that time, and so building those sorts of jumps into the revenue requirements analysis as well. But in general, we're looking at the O&M, the administration, the capital, and trying to decide within the plan, is it best to fund that capital with cash? Is it best to look at debt service assumptions with that capital and really try to dial in and smooth out what that rate revenue requirement is expected to be over time in order to smooth the rates over time as we look to implement the increases. From an operation administration standpoint within the budget, currently $7 million projected, in the 2027 timeframe, growing to around a $10 million operation administration aspect of the budget by that 2035 timeframe. We are accounting for rising costs. I mentioned addressing escalation and inflation within the model, uniquely looking at operational increase requirements that'll likely come along with major facility projects like the water treatment plant, and building all of that into a future revenue requirements projection. That projection, as you can see here, how we built that out from the various subcategories of the budget, the water purification, the water distribution, customer counts, admin in general. All of those aspects of the budget are being forecasted forward. You can see how the budget from an operation administration standpoint, like I mentioned, grows from around $7 million in the 2026 budget all the way up to that projected $9.9 million.
Back on that prior slide to this one, I mean, the water purification, I mean, everything goes up over time, the cost for it, but it's a higher percentage needed to be purified? Is that what I saw on the prior slide?
In the 2034 timeframe, so what that prior slide was mentioning, and it's pointed out right here in this table, in the 2034 timeframe where we look to commission the new water treatment plant around that time within the projection, we've bumped up the O&M budget for water purification.
Okay, so it's not that we need to purify more
No,
water?
no,
than-
it's that
okay,
you're going to be
all right,
operating something new and different that requires a
Yeah.
little bit different attention.
Okay.
Yep. For the water treatment improvements, so we mentioned a little bit the operational cost aspect of what we're including and how we're growing the operation administration revenue needs of the utility. In addition to that, as I mentioned, we're also making certain preliminary debt service assumptions within the overall model forecast. And for those assumptions, you know, especially on the water treatment plant project, we're looking at a potential 30-year term with subsidized interest, assuming we'll have the ability to be successful either through USDA, SRF, potentially EPA, WIFIA, you know, all the number of programs that exist out there for public water systems to get ourselves somewhere in that neighborhood of a good subsidized interest rate. There is potential with some of those programs to go, you know, potentially as long as 40 years. Right now, we're more conservatively modeling a 30-year time frame on that major debt, just to try and like I said, dial in the potential to where the revenue requirements are going to need to be in relation to debt service of those major facility projects. So those terms are all being modeled in. One thing I'd highlight, each of those programs requires different debt covenants. And one of the big debt covenants that you are looking at within a major debt service issuance like that is coverage. And so we are modeling right now just a static 120% coverage. What that means, if you're not familiar with public finance, is essentially you need to generate 20% more in revenue, in free revenue, than actually is required to make the P&I payment in order to have that security, in essence, of the revenue that you are generating. So we're modeling that within the model. That may change over time as well. As we consider, like I said, initial increases and pivots as we get 3 years down the road and look at maybe secondary increases to be considered. That is right now, though, rather significant. You know, I just talked about the O&M budget growing to nearly 10 million. We're talking about debt service nearly equally in that by the time we get to plant implementation, if we are on more that higher track of the capital presented within the master plan. So as far as how we are timing the capital projects within the master plan and planning to fund them, these are all of the major items that were identified in the master plan implementation scenarios. You can see, I think, many of these projects you will recognize. This graphic or this table is just really meant to highlight how we are timing those projects out across our planning period. And then anywhere where you see the little green check mark near that, those are projects that we have preliminarily planned to be debt serviced within that time frame. Just, you know, if it's possible, you would try to cash fund as much of this, but cash funding, given the position we're in right now with the utility, would require really, really high early rate increases beyond even what we're currently considering. And so in a way to smooth out the revenue requirements, especially in the near term, and give ourselves some time to catch up with the increases that are being projected, a bulk of what we are looking at for the capital projects, we are looking at debt servicing them. The one other item I would note is as we consider more of the ongoing annual type of renewal and rehabilitation of the system, pipe improvements and pipe replacement projects were a big need that was highlighted within the master plan. That was recommended in that $2.5 to $3 million annually range. We are not trying to do that immediately. We're trying to grow our ability into doing that over time in order, again, like I said, to smooth out the increases and give ourselves some time to generate the revenue to do that. The one thing when we look at debt service coverage in a utility like this is when you're generating that 110, 120%, et cetera, you can use that free cash flow, that extra 20% that's generated, on cash funded capital improvements such as pipe replacement programs. And so there is kind of a positive aspect of having larger debt service, is it does give you the ability to phase into the type of pipe improvements that we're looking at there on that bottom row. Also why we are kind of holding off within the model to get to more of that full $2 to $2.5 million range till we're fully loaded with that debt service as projected within the overall model. So when we put it all together and we look at the total forecasted operations and maintenance, cash, funded capital, and debt service requirements of the utility, this is for the $150 million master plan implementation scenario, our total projection of the revenue requirements of the water fund. So, you know, like I mentioned, here in 2027, we look at the O&M budget and the capital budget of just under $9 million. That is growing significantly by the 2035 timeframe to around $21 to $22 million annually. So that is really our target as we look at increasing revenues. How do we grow ourselves into that as a utility in order to be able to fund those revenue requirements, including those operation expenses, that cash funded capital, like I mentioned, with the pipe replacement, and then the overall debt service projections for those facility and storage pump station type of improvements in the master plan. When we consider growing revenues within the overall modeling effort of the rate study, you know, like I mentioned, we do have the 2026 budgeted revenues of $8.2 million. Approximately 85% of your current revenue is rate revenue, and you do have investment income, you do have your tap fees. But as I mentioned, you're not a fast-growing utility in Estes Park, and so your other revenues recognize that, I would say, in terms of how you're budgeting. You know, they're not growing quickly. They're not a major portion of what you do look at as far as each year's budgeted revenues. And as we look at growing those revenues over time, not considering any increases, we are growing those revenues on a rather modest basis. You can see at a 0.5% for residential and 1.5% for non-residential rate classes within the utility. So we are modeling in some, like I said, quite modest growth. And as we look at where the increases are going to be necessary and where you have the ability to really increase revenue, largely it is going to be within that rate revenue overall, what you charge your residential, your non-residential classes of customers. When we get to phase two, we were, like I mentioned, we will really look to dial in for residential, urban and rural, your non-residential pumped zones and non-pumped zones, all of the various classes that you do serve. We'll look at the cost of service of those classes and try to determine, as we grow that, what makes the most sense for each in terms of how we analyze cost of service and who's driving the costs with each of the, you know, within the revenue requirements that are being forecasted. So as we look at the increases, this is starting to forecast on the $150 million implementation scenario. What are we really looking at? We're targeting an overall rate revenue increase for the first 5 years of the modeling period in order to meet the rate revenue requirements that I just highlighted on that bar graph a few slides ago. Roughly a 16% increase for 5 years straight in order to do so. We're not calling that a 16% rate increase. That's the revenue increase, including the consideration of growth. If we back that off, you'll see in a moment that equates to roughly a 15% revenue increase, given that 1% growth aspect, like I said, that we are modeling in. And growing that over time, like I mentioned, to meet that rate revenue requirement out in that 2035 timeframe, growing to near that $21 to $22 million annually. This is just a very quick snapshot of all the things we are paying attention to within the model. We're tracking fund balances, we're tracking current debt covenants that are in place and are expected to be in place moving forward, tracking those coverage ratios, as I mentioned. This is really our cheat sheet when we're playing with all of those different underlying variables. And as we look at how the model really is performing over time under the different scenarios, are we generating the cash we needed through the rate increases that are being implemented and meeting the various obligations that the utility is likely to have in the form of debt covenants moving forward? So as far as actual rate revenue increases that are being modeled, as I just mentioned, We're targeting that 16% overall revenue increase. When we back out the growth, we're looking at, under this $150 million higher end implementation scenario, roughly 5 years straight of 15% increases. If that were to be applied just to your residential class, and we're not saying it uniquely will be, we will look at cost of service, but if it were to be applied just to your residential class, you can see how you grow from around $80 a month for a typical residential customer using 4,500 gallons of water a month. If we model that forward, you can see how that grows across the period. And a 15-year rate increase, or sorry, a 15% rate increase, 5 years consecutively, essentially doubles that typical residential bill in a 5-year time frame. When we track the affordability of that, we just use the EPA benchmark of 1.5% to 2.5% of median household income. You can see, we're in that line right now in 2026. If we look at the growth, potential growth of MHI over time and how water rates are expected to grow, we stay generally in that range for the bulk of this modeled period, but we do start to bump up against it and grow out of that. We're projecting in the back end of the model on that 2033 to 2035 timeframe. So large increases, like we mentioned, would be necessary for that higher implementation scenario. We don't know if we're necessarily going to land at that high implementation scenario, but this is, like I said, that top range of modeling that we did. We did also look at the $110 million model. And so if we were on the lower end, how would those increases adjust? So bringing ourselves to that, like I said, that pivot point of maybe we've been successful with outside funding, maybe we've been successful with better scaling the projects and implementing projects as they're identified, better bid prices. All of those different aspects could come into play and driving us towards the lower end of the range that we're currently analyzing. You can see in this case, we have built that second model to analyze that and look at what increases potentially would be necessary. And in that instance, we're looking at the ability to not have to go straight 15s for a 5-year period, the ability after that initial implementation period to backing off those overall revenue increases and rate increases necessary to more in that 10% range for a few years in order to drive towards that lower end of the master plan implementation range. So this is where I get to what I mentioned earlier, really trying to dial in a phased approach to this, where I think we really want to look at this from the standpoint of a primary implementation period. It's going to be necessary, I think, regardless of tracking high or tracking low on the overall implementation. Give ourselves a couple years to figure that out, and then at a pivot point, potentially back that off or right-size that in a few years once we know more about the track we are headed on. So really a primary, secondary, and long-term implementation consideration within the modeling. As far as rate comparisons, we work with a lot of systems much like Estes Park. A couple of these listed here are not who we uniquely work with, but I have done water rate studies for Whitefish, Montana. I've looked at water rate studies for Big Sky, Montana, and we've done work in the Jackson Hole area, similar type of high elevation systems. You've got smaller populations, you've got the tourism aspect of people are here sometimes, but not all the time, utilizing your systems. It does become challenging. We've even done some of this work in like Minnesota Lakes country where it's really busy in the summer and it's not so much in the winter. And how you plan for that and how you balance your rates in terms of the fixed aspect and the variable aspect of the rates and what you charge, it can be very challenging in the type of circumstances that Estes Park you see yourself in. We look at this, there's pressure on those types of systems, especially in the region here as well. You look at Telluride and Steamboat, Pinewood. We just did some quick math on where they're at currently and what they're planning for. Many of them are being faced with similar challenges, and they're in similar starting points to you as well, where they're looking at continued increases. I think you're also aware of what's going on in the Upper Thompson district related to their water resource recovery facility and what's being planned there as far as increases. I know that puts pressure in the same location on what you're trying to do as the town of Estes Park with your water utility. And so I know as a board and trustees, you're definitely being very conscientious of that as well, to make sure that you look at the overall cost of service within the town related to all utilities being provided. So on those considerations, I think it really comes down to what I just mentioned a couple of slides ago related to that primary implementation, getting started and not letting perfect be the enemy of good. We do know we're headed towards something large within the utility, and the plan will continue to be worked and refined over the next few years, but increases are going to be necessary to do so. The beauty of that primary secondary implementation as well is I don't believe you're at a risk by raising rates in that primary stage of, I'll say, disproportionately finding yourself out of whack when it comes to cost of service within your customer classes. So we'll have time to implement the initial increases, dial in cost of service, and then look at more unique increases by class as we get into the implementation phase, more towards the secondary implementation, along with also dialing in the costs for that secondary implementation phase overall. Obviously, we're here today for trustee feedback on the study. Our next steps is to take feedback from you here today, incorporate that feedback, finalize our primary rate study report. As Jackie mentioned, what we presented today here is preliminary. We will make some likely final tweaks as the CAFR comes in and we see where we land on the 2025 CAFR and ultimately end of year cash balance projections for 2026 as we move over the next couple of months. We'll make those tweaks, finalize our rate study report, and then we'll look to start scoping that second phase of the study with the town staff moving forward. That I would stand for any questions. Everybody was very polite and allowed me to just plow through.
Well, we knew it would be substantial. Obviously, if we had started smoothing rates 20 years ago, we would have had a longer horizon to smooth over. But we were well educated on the aging of a variety of those. Some of them are pretty old components and storage tanks and piping and things. So I'm not surprised by the numbers. Obviously, this will generate a lot of community discussion. Questions or comments from folks?
Hello. It's funny how these lights work. I wonder how other communities have shared this responsibility with visitors to their communities. In the case that we're in, for me to see my bill double at my house, where I use 800 or 1,000 gallons of water a month, that's going to give me heartburn to be financing all of this development for all of these people. So perhaps that's a better question for our own staff. I'm sure there's a plan in place to have that conversation, because I'm not talking about my water bill, I'm talking about my neighbor's water bill and 50 of my other neighbors. Right. Because now that the numbers are visible and we're talking about numbers, I'll bet there's more public input. So can I ask on my behalf of my neighbors, how are we going to share this with visitors to our community?
Sure. You mean share their cost or the
Yes,
burden? Yeah.
yes.
So phase 2 is an important step in this. What Sean was mentioning is the immediate need for implementation in those first 3 years. So while those first 3 years of the 15% are implemented, we'll have the opportunity to look at the phase 2 study, which looks at things like, is there a different rate structure that we can use to share more of the cost with visitors and guests who come here sometimes versus full-time residents and long-term residents? That really happens in phase 2 because we don't have the ability to answer it right now. He's going to look at, the AE2S team will look at that as part of the overall rate structure, and does it make sense, and do we need to distribute differently, and are there examples of other communities that have large influxes of visitors that maybe could share more of the burden and so forth. So that is definitely a great question and part of the overall phase 2 study to take a look at that.
I would imagine that you use the smallest number you could find for a single-family house with just a few gallons to say it's just going to be this much. But a commercial user or other people that I hear from that are paying a lot more for water than I am are probably going to get on the phone faster. So I think that it's worth considering talking about that earlier than later on how that responsibility will be shared. So my question stands, how do other communities handle that? And perhaps not for answer today, but I'd like to know how other people are solving this challenge.
To just build on what Jackie mentioned there's ways that we can look at it within the rate classes and the rate structure itself. You know, when you're talking cost of service, what you want to look at is the seasonality of service, especially in a town like Estes Park where there's a lot of seasonality, how seasonality drives different peaking factors, which can drive, that ultimately drives how you size your facilities overall, which of your customers that you're serving are you know, high seasonality, high peaking factors, driving up capacity requirements. Dialing that in, that's really the cost of service aspect of that second phase, as I mentioned. I mean, and many utilities, when they have the ability, they also do look at outside revenue sources such as sales tax. And we have helped a lot of utilities where they do have that ability. Sometimes it's legally restricted. Sometimes it's with like home rule charter, they have the ability to do it just locally and raise that. I don't recall what uniquely Estes's rules are related to sales tax, but that is very often a conversation that is looked at in the overall, you know, large capital plan implementation that is visitor revenue in many regards. We do know your local residents pay sales tax as well, but in the balance of everything, that's also often looked at.
Yeah, we are familiar with those conversations.
Yep.
Thanks.
I had a wonderful water treatment plant tour earlier this week, which was fantastic. And there's some concern that the longer we go with our current water treatment plants, the higher risk there are for problems happening. So I know we want to implement this as soon as possible, and the implementation timeline here is 9 years. Is there a chance that we would implement faster to decrease those risks? And if so, would we have to raise rates faster?
We laid out a relatively conservative schedule for implementation of the plant, and with the idea of next year looking for a siting study, figuring out our financing plan, and making those first steps in real planning. There is a chance we can move faster, but in order to be the most conservative we could in how we're raising rates and looking at implementation, we did lay out a careful schedule to take time. Now, certainly we will speed things up any way we can, but if we do speed things up, as you mentioned, it does create the need for that additional revenue to cover that. So right now it's laid out as if the plant would be built roughly 2031 timeframe for construction of the plant and implementation. If we can do it faster, that'd be great. I'm sure James would appreciate it. But it does take time by the time you design, permit, site, et cetera, and then have the community outreach that we need to do for something that's a generational project like this.
Thanks.
So you're thinking start of construction, 2031?
Yeah, 2031, complete in 2032. We had a 2-year window. Hopefully it can go faster. And we know there are ways to
Definitely.
shut it down, to do it faster. But, you know, look at Upper Thompson. It took, 15 years to implement theirs? So it takes a while to get all the pieces and parts in play and the funding in place and the documentation and support studies that need to go into the funding. Sean did mention the opportunity for grants and principal interest forgiveness and ways to reduce what we are paying for. Right now, the worst-case assumption is everything is being paid for with no grants. We don't think that's what's going to happen, you know, because there are grants available. There are opportunities for lower interest rates than even what they modeled and for more opportunistic funding sources. Right now, again, worst case scenario, and that gives us that first couple years of 15%, and then that's that pivot point he was talking about. We'll have a better plan. We'll have a better idea exactly what things cost and what our funding looks like, and that may give us an opportunity then to reduce the first initial 15% down as we proceed forward. So that's that pivot point that he showed in the graph. And that kind of helps us with, you know, what does it look like going forward?
Yeah, I'm fully in support of implementing this percentage very quickly. I think 4 years of not implementing any rate increases has been a real tough thing for the community to deal with. It's going to make that 15%, might have been a little lower, but that's water under the bridge now. We're at where we're at. When are you thinking the second phase, because of the details of things? Are we thinking 2 years out for that, 3 years out for the second phase, the tap fee studies, looking at all those different things, the people that own second homes here, they don't use water, but we have to be ready to provide
Right.
them water. All those type of things have to.
So we have the
come into play.
rate study phase 1 for this year. And then we would come back to the board at the end of the year requesting approval of the rate study and the rate increase after the public outreach and public hearing process. Then the phase 2 would start in 2027, and I think it's 18 months to finish that, 12 or 18 months? Phase 2?
No, I mean, I think we could probably have, if we were to start early next year with an approval later this year, I think we could be back in front of you around similar timeframe.
Okay, so about a year.
With preliminary reckoning, yeah.
Good. All right, thank you. You're asking for input in that, and when I look at, some of the projected costs for things you got the plant, and then I see the $8 to $12 million for Mary's Lake, and again, my opinion, there's other people that have different opinions, but I get we have to harden that plant for construction purposes. It's going to be a primary thing, but I'd personally like to not see spending that much money on a plant that we plan on decommissioning. You want input, I'm giving you my input. I realize that we're going to have to do some things to shore it up, but it concerns me to spend that much, and I'd much rather look at the $115 million plan than 150 on this. I had other questions on here that would be more relational to the second phase on details, so I won't ask those now. I did see like $4.5 million in the water fund in 26. Is that capital available to spend, or does that include the O&M, the 90-day O&M reserves that we have to hold? I'm just curious how much, if we know yet, how much we actually have available for capital
Yeah,
spending for
I
projects.
don't know that. I'm sorry,
Okay.
I do not know that answer.
Okay,
We started the model on what the 2026 budget projected for end-of-year cash balances. Jackie has indicated that there's a possibility that will come in lower, which may soften the front end of this a little bit. But we are, Trustee Eshman, to your question, we are looking at, in that total cash balance, that restricted covenant of the O&M obligation and making sure we're not dipping into that as we model things forward, for sure.
so that $4.5 million is like taking that out, or is that including that? I'm just curious.
That included, so that 2026 end-of-year cash balance included the projected O&M obligation, so that's total cash.
So the reserves are
Yeah.
a lot smaller than that.
We also have a debt that retires in 2028 that they also included in the modeling analysis. So as we retire debt, we are including that retirement of debt into taking a look at what we have, and then required additional, that frees up some money, basically.
Sure, Mary's Lake.
Yeah.
Treatment plant debt. Okay. I've stated those concerns, and also like the pump station, the cost of that, I think we could do better. So there's my input. I think we could get away from this 150 with some value engineering thinking. So anyways, there you go. Thanks.
A couple of my comments and questions have kind of been asked already, so I'll build on those first. Can we talk a little bit more about that timeline that you were just touching on, and the budget process and the public outreach piece? So can you talk about that? So that you're gonna fill, the proposal that you're putting out there right now is that this 15% will be incorporated in the 2027 budget, knowing we were gonna have some 2025 numbers coming in, all those kinds of
Right.
things. But we would need to approve that toward the end of this year. So we're gonna build the budget hoping that the board approves it.
Right.
Can you just build on that? And like how the public input piece, your timing for when you expect that to happen? You get what I'm just trying to
Yeah.
understand the step-by-step
I
flow
do.
of that.
So we are immediately going to start with the outreach to the public, talking about what the preliminary findings of the rate study are. When they've come in and asked about things like, will this affect our rates from the master plan? We said, yes, we expect double-digit rate increases. So we haven't been bashful about saying it's going to be double-digit rate increases. We just haven't said 15%.
Sure.
So now this gives us an opportunity to say mid-double digits for at least 3 years. Typically, we'll come back to you with a rate study in a 3 to 5 year window. So we would come back again. So that's perfect timing for the 3-year 15%, and then come back and do another rate study to say we're at that pivot point. Does it make sense to continue with 15, or have we refined those costs, as Trustee Eshelman mentioned, and get down to a lesser than 15 for the subsequent years? But that'll all be part of that initial outreach to the public, because it's not going to, even with the lower cost, be less at the beginning. We need to start generating that cash in order to allow us to fund and position ourselves to be able to fund the large project, whether it's 110 million or 150 million, we still need more revenue coming in.
Right.
So immediately start with that. We're working with Public Information Officer Miller and with an outside consultant on how do we do that outreach. We're also following the good example Upper Thompson had with how they did some of their outreach. So follow their example, come up with some unique things for us, and then make sure that that's a clear message to the public as we go forward toward the rate increase public hearings. We'll have hopefully a lot more input from the public so that we've adjusted our messaging as we go forward.
Yeah, I think, and I appreciate the public input process, and I think I would almost I think we need to consider this as a public education process, and I think that's where I'm landing, is helping myself understand what the timeline is going to be when we needed to consider when these funds when a rate increase would need to be approved or disapproved by the board, how it works on the budget, because I think this is one of those examples where we need to hear where the public is and a lot of what they think, and has to be an understanding that nobody's going to like paying more, and we have to make a decision that is responsible for the future of our community and the water that we provide. So I think that's where I'm trying to, we want to hear how the public feels about it, and I think we are just, backs against the wall and needing to make a decision about getting this in place. So that's not really a comment or a question, just more of a statement. But I did have a question about the growth projection slide on the revenue overview slide. Where, I don't want to get too far in the weeds because I know we're coming on time for this item too, but where did you get the 0.5% for residential, 1.5% for non-residential, at 0 for bulk, and why on those growth projections?
Yeah, I can talk to at least part of that. When we did the Harvey Economics population projection study, one of the things they looked at is, would there be growth in the bulk water and in the YMCA? There was a slight growth in the bulk water. There was 0 in the YMCA. We did talk with Y, are they planning on more beds, that kind of thing. They said no, so they're staying pretty flat on their overall growth of customers and guests, therefore water demand. If anything, hopefully it'll go down, because as they rehab, cabins and so forth with low flow.
More efficiency.
More efficient features, then it hopefully would go down. But modeling that one at 0 aligns with what they had told us, and also with what we hope to see with water reduction from them. A bulk water customer, again, we're being conservative with saying it's 0 growth there. The 1.5% and 1% were tied to the Harvey Economic Study, and we can certainly refine those as we look into this phase 2, piece 2.
Okay, thanks.
I have 2 questions. One fairly simple, other not so simple. And I kind of share with Trustee Eshelman that most of my questions relate to phase 2, because that's where the rubber really starts to hit the road, and the allocation of the cost increases amongst the different classes. Then it gets a little messy. But at this level, we're just painting with broad strokes. But my simple question is that 2034 bump in operating costs, is that primarily staff costs or something else likely?
We haven't done a detailed operational
No, I
study
know
at
you
this
haven't
point.
done- I
What we
get it.
know is it's probably going to be more when you consider year-round operations, potential technology changes, staffing changes as well.
So
So
it's kind of a
we're-
idea that it's going to be more, but we don't know
we're
where.
ballparking it. That's one of those things
Okay,
we'll
fair
continue to
enough.
study as the,
Yeah, when we get deeper into it, we'll
I mean,
get more.
technology can really affect what that requires, and all those final selections
Yeah.
haven't been made. So.
Okay, and the
We'll
other,
add a little bit to that too. For a little while, we will have Mary's Lake Glacier and the new
Yeah.
plant running. So we'll
You'll
have
have three
three
running at
running
once.
until the new plant basically finds its feet and gets going. And then we retire Glacier. So there's a small window where we have multiple facilities, even Glacier, until it's retired.
okay, well, your water people have to be several places at once all the time already, so, nothing, yeah. The other issue is, you know, we're, again, painting with broad strokes. You know, I'm concerned about what happens if the cost estimates on the design end up being wildly in excess of what we think right now. Because there's always that risk. And obviously, we can play with the revenue side and the rate stuff, but I don't understand with a water treatment center or facility, what the design options are to keep the costs down. I mean, I suppose it may be anything from the method of treatment to the capacity of treatment and other things like that. But is that something that may well arise to?
Yeah, and I think Trustee Eshelman mentioned the phrase value engineering. So
Yeah,
typically what we'll
exactly,
do is we
right.
come in, we have the engineer help us, we design it, they come up with an opinion of probable construction cost. We look at that and go, wow, that's way more than our budget. What can we do to make this cheaper? And then you start looking at what options, what ideas do people have? Is it a different process? Is it a different piping configuration? Is it a different building material? I mean, there's all kinds of things that could go into optimizing that cost if it comes in excess of our estimate. We will continuously push for that during design to keep those items as cost effective as possible, but not being cheap. Because we've got to have a plant that operates well and is good technology and so forth, but it's cost effective. So
Yeah.
it's a balance.
I'd hate to, you know, just pull the plug on the whole thing and have to start and redesign from scratch.
Right.
So as you go through it,
Right.
you're going to be looking at that stuff.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
We also saw in our recent tours, which I think all the trustees were able to take, examples of cost-cutting measures that were taken in the two plants that we've got that are
Paying for
tripping
now.
us up now.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you have to design to the best ability that you can when we do this thing. We want it to last 50 years or more. So care with that.
I'll make my last two comments quick. Again, input, I'd like to see that timeframe accelerated. I know that Sean makes your job that much more interesting. But I think with conversations, there's maybe ways to do that, because in this environment, every year that goes by, we've seen the crazy escalation of things, and the longer we wait, and believe me, with my time on Upper Thompson's board, I don't think we want to delay if we don't have to. And the other comment is just, I am glad to see AE2S Nexus doing this. They're very capable, and they're familiar with our system, and so it's a pleasure that you'll be working with us and have great confidence in you. So that's it.
Well, we have to have water to run a town. This has to be done because the facilities have gotten to the point where it has to be done. It's tough to look at that, and yet we have to move forward. What other input do you need at this point? Did you get the input
Yeah,
you needed?
I think we
Okay.
did. You all would like to see us work on this schedule so that we can implement a little quicker. Like to see phase 2 information sooner rather than later, so that we're looking at our rate structure. Want to see a few more comparisons with other communities that have the same type of visitor and tourism influx that we do, and if there's different funding mechanisms there. Those are the 3 largest takeaways I got standing at the top, rattling off the top of my head here, and then we'll do more community education versus input.
I'd just like to make one more comment on the comparison of the communities. I think it's nice to see, but I also think we need to be careful about that because we are what we are where we're at. And I also think we need to be careful about making political decisions on infrastructure and rates. The numbers tell us where we need to be, and so I would caution us all to be very aware of those type of decisions. So myself personally, I don't want to get too deep into the comparison of other communities. We know we have to deal with what we have to deal with. So there's my comment. If anybody else wants to agree or disagree with that, they can.
Okay.
Sorry, Trustee Eshelman, I would just say, we do publish annually as a company our utility rate survey across all the geographies that we serve, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Montana, Utah, Colorado, Iowa. And in that rate survey, you will always see really, really low rates and you will always see really, really high rates. But one thing I have always noticed as we publish that data annually is you'll consistently see systems that find themselves and set themselves up with the ability to always hover around the middle. And as I know and learn more about those systems, or if they're systems that we work with, those are generally the systems that plan the best, that they don't have the shocks. They don't go really low, they don't go really high. And so there is value in benchmarking, but everyone has their own story within that benchmarking in terms of how they got so low or how they got so high. And usually it has to do with didn't make a big decision until it was too late, then made the big decision. And good planning usually results in finding yourself somewhere near the median of where those rates, compare to other systems.
A very important topic, thank you. Got a couple of other very important topics we'll move on to. Carly, you can just talk 22% faster to make up for the time here. So housing definitions and density bonuses in the development code.
Gotta find my mouse. Bunny? There we go. Oh my gosh. Do I go down? There I am. Okay, sorry. It's my first time presenting to you all. All right. So we're here today to discuss housing definitions and density bonuses within the development code in response to the town board's 2026 strategic plan goals. We're not here to make any final decisions, rather gather your feedback on several key questions. That's going to guide future town housing policies, updates to the development code that come back for y'all's consideration. The presentations, the slides are included in your packet, and we're going to pause throughout the presentation to highlight certain policy questions, and then also allotted enough time, the second half of what was an hour, so whatever's left of that, for the discussion and the direction. So slides shouldn't take up the whole presentation here. Like I said, this work responds directly to two objectives included in the town board's 2026 strategic plan. We're evaluating whether the housing definitions and density bonus provisions in section 11.4 of the development code continue to reflect the community's housing needs. Considering whether town policies defining workforce and attainable housing should be updated so that our funding programs and regulatory tools are working in alignment. What you're seeing today was a collaborative effort between the town, including community development, as well as the Estes Park Housing Authority, who is on the meeting virtually. So Real Estate Development Director Pete Levine and Executive Director Moulton are both available to answer questions. So we all work together to conduct a lot of research and practices and develop these various options and frameworks for your consideration today. We're looking for feedback in four primary areas, including affordability targets, where density incentives should apply, could apply, and whether those incentives are strong enough to actually encourage the development we want to see in the community, as well as like what other tools might accompany density bonuses. So to do this, we're going to look at these four questions. These four questions were in your packet as well. We're going to look at what level of density is appropriate if we want to encourage housing that's affordable to lower income workforce households. Should these incentives remain limited to RM zoning, or should they be available in additional zoning districts? Are density bonuses alone enough to improve project feasibility? And finally, should density bonuses be paired with other incentives, such as additional height or parking flexibility or modified development standards? So like I said, we'll work through these step by step. To get started, in your packet, we reviewed the strong history that Estes Park has had with density bonuses to incentivize housing. So for more than 2 decades, density bonuses have been a part of our Estes Park Development Code. Due to a lack of utilization of the density bonus structure from 2013 through 17, the town expanded the incentive by allowing projects to double the base density, increase the definition of attainable housing eligibility to households earning up to 150% AMI, and then added height bonuses. Since those changes in 17, the density bonus program has contributed to the development of approximately 188 workforce or attainable housing units in the Estes Valley, including Peakview, Prospector Apartments, Wildfire Neighborhood, and Grand Estates. However, at the same time in 2017, eligibility for density bonuses were limited to RM zoning districts. So with an incredibly limited number of vacant RM, which is residential multifamily zoned areas, developers of workforce or attainable housing who seek to utilize these density bonuses have to rezone their property ahead of pursuing any developments, which poses a barrier. So the utilization of the current density bonus incentive structure is low, and we believe it's due to these factors. The current incentive does not differentiate between projects serving households at various AMI levels. So as a result, there's little financial incentive for a developer to provide housing at lower affordability levels when market rate or higher income attainable housing is going to be more financially viable. Development costs continue to rise, while uncertainty related to financing infrastructure and construction makes affordable housing projects increasingly difficult to pencil out, especially for private developers. And as mentioned in the previous slide, there are very few remaining RM, residential multifamily zoned, vacant land available for development. With only limited number of sites remaining across the valley, private developers must carefully weigh the financial risk of developing workforce housing contingent upon the approval of that rezoning. So at the same time, through the development code update process and community outreach that's occurred over the last year, we've heard consistent support for expanding housing opportunities for middle-income households while also maintaining neighborhood character. We've also heard from this board a desire to explore housing options that serve households below the current definition of attainable housing of 150% AMI. So taking all of this together, these factors suggest that it's appropriate for us to evaluate whether the town's current incentive framework is affecting the advancement of the community's workforce housing goals, and whether adjustments should be considered to better align with incentives with the desired affordability outcomes. So, with that taken into account, staff looked at that evaluation and the 2026 strategic objectives that you've provided and proposed 3 areas for discussion for the board to consider this afternoon, evening, and provide feedback to us to help move the needle for more workforce housing across AMI levels. So we asked the board to consider whether density bonuses could scale based on affordability levels, whether incentive eligibility should expand into additional zoning districts, And third, how incentives can better reflect today's development environment in the Estes Valley. Again, these aren't final recommendations. These are relatively high-level policy concepts that are intended to help frame the discussion to address the strategic plan objective. Staff would receive that feedback of the framework and policy from today, and then bring back recommendations and actionable items. So we'll first dive into the first proposed area for the board to consider by looking at these 3 questions. Is additional incentive needed for more affordable workforce options? And if so, what affordability levels are we hoping to target? At what AMI? And then at what density are we comfortable with allowing to truly incentivize that affordability? So this first concept as AMI scaled density bonus structure creates a clear relationship between affordability and the incentives. So for example, if a project serving a household below 60% AMI may qualify for a larger density bonus than a project that serves, higher income levels. The objective would be better aligned with the level of incentive, would better align the level of incentive with the level of public benefit being provided. As staff explored this concept, we found that there's not a simple formula or calculation, we tried, that directly links affordability levels to a specific density bonus. Project feasibility depends on many factors, including land costs, infrastructure requirements, site conditions, engineering, and construction costs. So these variables can vary significantly from one developable site to another. So rather than presenting a one-size-fits-all recommendation, again, we're looking for some high-level just direction for us to continue down. We could either return with more detailed options for consideration, or determine that those changes to the current incentive aren't warranted. But one of the most important concepts to kind of understand when we're looking at this density and the difference between affordable housing and how it operates compared to market rate housing. It's a very different financial model. So to keep rents affordable, someone has to make up the difference between what it costs to build a home and what residents can afford to pay. The funding gap can be filled through public subsidies, grants, tax credits, development incentives, density bonus, like the density bonuses. You've seen the Housing Authority come up here and show where they are grabbing funds from all sorts of different avenues to make that affordable. So today, multifamily housing costs roughly $500,000 to $800,000 per unit, or per door, you might heard us say, to develop. So depending on the property and the infrastructure needs. The Housing Authority mentioned in our last meeting that they have a project currently in pre-development that's looking at about $650,000 per unit. So those costs have to be made up somewhere. The current base density in RM zoned areas is 8 units per acre, and the existing density bonus is that 16 units per acre. Again, that's with that deed restriction for either workforce or attainable, and just highlights that the higher density allows for more units and more revenue from each unit, which offsets the overall costs for development. So before we really dive into what future density could look like in our community, we wanted to pause and just take a minute to provide some examples of higher density that already exists within Estes Park, within the Estes Valley. So you might be familiar with this one. This is a relatively recent workforce housing development, 14 units per acre. It was privately developed and utilized existing incentive structure. This next one was privately operated and income restricted housing. So this is deed restricted for income. And it was developed in the 80s. It was recently renovated to meet LIHTC requirements and continue that deed restriction. And again, these examples aren't necessarily here to suggest exact densities, but rather provide some visual reference as we discuss these potential changes. Moving further along down Highway 7, another privately developed property around the same time, 80s-ish, Without any deed restrictions, these are about 17 units per acre. And then we recognize this. This is the lower portion of the Fall River Village workforce housing acquisition that the Housing Authority purchased a couple years ago and operates as workforce housing. That's at about 19.46 units. And that's just the lower level. We didn't include what we call the upper Fall River Village that has a little bit different structure of development. So if we want housing that's affordable to households at lower income levels, what level of development incentive is appropriate to make those projects financially feasible? We have that current base density of 8 units per acre. If those units are restricted, we're looking at 17 units per acre. If we want to increase affordability by increasing density, taking, for example, what affordable workforce may look like if we restricted it under 60% AMI. We would be looking at 16 plus units per acre. And that's kind of a question mark, right? So what is that density? What's a density that not only the community would be comfortable with, but also balances the cost to build these affordable units? So to provide context, staff looked at this is base residential, this isn't any incentive, in comparable Colorado mountain communities. Again, while every community is unique, has its unique housing needs, development patterns, and zoning regulations, this comparison demonstrates that Estes Park generally has lower base residential densities than many of our peer communities. This comparison helps frame the policy discussion around what level of residential density the board believes is appropriate to support the town's workforce housing goals. Also worth noting that a base density of 8 units per acre is generally no longer sufficient to support financial feasibility of new multifamily housing development in the Estes Valley. Even with the current density bonus of 16 units per acre, that's a lot closer to the density that's needed for many projects to become economically viable. But the feasibility, of course, continues to be dependent upon site and construction costs, et cetera. So Real Estate Development Director Levine actually conducted this research on other communities and put together a lot of that data and information. In addition to looking at that base density for housing projects, he also gathered valuable information about incentive structures and tools on top of that density conversation. So we found that successful affordable housing programs rarely rely on density bonuses alone. Most communities combine density with additional tools such as increased building height, parking flexibility, reduced setbacks, or streamlined development review processes. In many cases, those communities also provide additional incentives for projects specifically around that deed-restricted affordability component. So the common theme, incentives become stronger as affordability requirements increase. And that takes us to this example in Netherlands, which demonstrates how high density and a mix of other incentives allowed for the creation of 26 deed-restricted units targeted for households earning 60% AMI or less, so down to 20% AMI. You've probably driven by this development. Back in, I think, 2020 it was built, and it's owned and managed by Boulder County Housing Authority. And as you can see, it's about 30 units per acre. So wrapping up kind of that first area for discussion is additional incentive needed. What affordability levels should we be prioritizing? And how much density is appropriate? I hope we're kind of tracking these questions as we go. So we're going to look at the second objective for this discussion, which is expanding the applicability of incentives across other zoning areas. Should incentives such as density bonuses be allowed in other zoned areas besides RM? So I've mentioned, these bonuses are limited to RM zoning. Knowing what we know about the inherent risk associated with a developer going through a rezoning process, and that there are only 2 vacant RM zoned lots right now left, the staff were asking whether we should include expanding applicability across other districts such as accommodation districts or selected commercial areas where workforce housing would be appropriate for those areas. Expanding this eligibility could reduce the need for rezoning while still allowing the town to apply standards and compatibility requirements to protect the area of where those zoning expansions would be. Going through. Finally, we want to discuss just overall project feasibility. Again, development costs have changed dramatically over the last several years, let alone since 2017. Density is a key way to support and incentivize deed-restricted housing, but there are other tools to consider in addition to that. We're asking you, what are other additional ways to reduce the risk and development barriers? These various tools exist to incentivize housing across various AMI levels. By reducing barriers and increasing confidence in the feasibility of development, the town can increase the confidence that developers have in creating this type of housing within our community. Supporting this feasibility and market alignment could include increasing allowable unit yield, providing greater flexibility in site design, streamlining review processes, or pairing density bonuses with additional incentives that reflect today's economic realities. So staff and Housing Authority we've all worked together on this with this one goal in mind, to create a more effective and predictable and financially viable framework for workforce and attainable housing development within Estes Park. And so we'd like to kind of wrap that up and close by returning to our 4 questions that we introduced here at the beginning. A reminder that we're not asking for the board to adopt any specific numbers or tools or language, rather direction for the overall framework, so we can continue to refine these concepts and return with more detailed recommendations to support your strategic plan objectives. I'll go ahead and leave this slide up to support the discussion, but I'm also happy to answer your questions. Like I said, we have representatives from the Housing Authority online, as well as from Planning and Community Development. Good. Yeah.
Hi. So I have a number of different opinions on this, on various aspects of it. The lower AMI levels are important to address, but effectively, they will largely be addressed by the Housing Authority and nobody else, I think. I think that's the reality of it. As such, I don't think the private developers generally want to have income-restricted units. If they have a LIHTC project, yes, but a lot of times those LIHTC projects are not done by private developers also. And so a developer generally doesn't like the income restriction. They love the workforce housing restriction. That's a lot easier to comply with. And I know with Prospector, they have some of each available, but if you go outside of Prospector, of things that are developed by private developers, they're generally going to be workforce housing and not income restricted. And I fear that by getting too deep into different levels of AMI, we're overcomplicating the thing insofar as, at least with respect to rental units, I think it's almost always going to be a Housing Authority project. And the Housing Authority also is subject to this new Home Act. And the Home Act reduces, and I'm not sure the parameters of it entirely, but my understanding is that it will eliminate some of the requirements that otherwise would be applicable to that sort of developer, and that might help with some of this anyway. So be that as it may, just to get into that, I just think that the AMI thing, I think it's fine to have an AMI level for, particularly for, in 2 areas. One for rental properties, which is generally going to be a 60 to 80% type level. But for ownership opportunities, it needs to be much higher. Right now, 150, I'm not sure 150 is really high enough, given the fact that the wages in Estes Park compared to the county averages. I'm not sure how well those compare. So we may want to look at even increasing that to something like 175%. I think that's worthwhile considering that we ought to think about that. But those are the only real areas of AMI. I would not, I think you either increase the density for a project to address the problem, or you don't, and having these variable levels of increased density, to me, doesn't make a lot of sense. Increased density, yes. Increased density at different levels, too complicated to make it work, I think. So, to answer your questions after that soliloquy, zoning districts, I don't think we've got any choice but to expand where we do bonuses in zoning districts. Accommodation districts are great. Most commercial districts would be fine too. I don't think we'd do it in a single-family residential district because that's a single family. Now, we have done that sort of with ADUs, so it's not like we haven't done it, but I think an ADU approach is a more viable approach for something like that. But zoning districts, I very much support increasing that, certainly to accommodation districts, A1 probably also, and commercial zoning districts.
Okay.
As far as the bonus levels, I mean, I think your survey of the other communities show that our base levels are too low. So I would advocate to increase our base levels in those zoning districts where that's permitted. And whether the bonus, I think I would want to talk to developers and to the housing authority about what levels of bonus off of that base level is really needed. And we don't want to become, we hear this all the time, you don't want to become Vail, and we don't want to become Breckenridge. And those other communities you looked at, none of them are Vail or Breckenridge. And they are pretty comparable to us. So that 16 to 20 base level looks like would be consistent with our peers, and that would be a good place to start. And as far as other tools, parking is something that's always come up. I think that makes sense. Maybe not in every zoning district that we're talking about. So outlying commercial, maybe not, but certainly downtown, which I guess we don't have any downtown, right? But some of the commercial districts and accommodation districts, particularly if they're anywhere close to our Highway 7, 34, 36, 66, any of that, to me makes a lot of sense. I don't know about other ones. You wonder what really is effective. And I think the one thing that has been proven to be effective is a bonus for workforce housing. And so I think that's the one that will work with private developers. And I'm not sure anything else you're going to do is really going to work with private developers. And then housing authority, I'd look to them to say, what is it that really would make a difference for you in the developments you're doing, and get some guidance from them.
If you don't mind, I wouldn't mind asking either Scott or Pete if they have any insight to answer that question or respond to that.
Hi, Carly. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I've messaged Pete. I think I'm going to let Pete take that one if he can.
Gotcha. Thanks, Scott. There's a wide variety of tools that can help. Certainly increasing the base density goes a long way. The parking ratios compared to other towns are pretty high as well. And so with most developments, you typically start with the parking, the drainage, and the emergency access. And so as you figure out those constraints, that's when you really understand what your developable land is. At 8 or even 16 units an acre, the height at 38 feet, we don't necessarily need to increase that. That's probably a tool that wouldn't facilitate as much increase in housing or affordability as a reduced parking ratio would, for example.
Thanks, Pete. I gotta echo. One of the things like I mentioned on a previous slide was going through that calculation of what would it take, what level of density on an acre would it take to incentivize a private developer to make it viable. And it was variable. There's so many factors that go into it. If we did want to look at affordability, 60% or below, and what density it would take, you're looking at significantly higher than 16. And so I wanted to just kind of reiterate that the idea of looking at that was to expand outside of only the housing authority providing those affordable units, and what would that density number look like. So I appreciate Pete jumping in and answering that question too, and then don't want to hijack the rest of it, but.
Kind of had the, excuse me, the same thought with talking to a couple builders that have gone through these processes themselves and asking them what would really incentivize this and change this from the experiences they've had in the past. And so I ran out of time before this meeting to do that, but I'd like to do that. Now, I had just the opposite thought of, I just felt like the more density that we allow and to meet parking, that means height to me, but Pete just said he doesn't think that 38 feet is a restrictive thing, but in my mind, I feel like if we start increasing that density a lot, we're gonna have to start wrestling with that height thing, and that's always been a large conversation in this community is the height restriction, so, but he said doesn't appear to be too much of an issue, so. Not giving much information here, but I would like to talk to some of the private builders to ask. I think their input would be extremely valuable in this.
Yep.
One of the first things you said, Carl, first, thanks for all the information and for asking us for the insight. I think that this is important to the success of this, that the community's bought in, the community's heard. This reflects the needs of the community and not what we were thinking years ago, because this has changed a lot. I've heard from developers also who don't want to compete with the housing authority and find this is challenging, and have even characterized the housing authority as a developer of market rate versus a tool for our community to use to provide housing that is subsidized or more dense, or not the ideal single-family home on a ranch 2 acres, but something where people can live and grow and build. So I would be inclined to support more density in some areas to allow the housing authority to provide that kind of an opportunity for people in the community. But I think we have to go back to one of the first questions you asked, which is defining or putting numbers on, or maybe in the form of an annual salary. What does, and we've talked about it for years, and I know we repeat it a lot, but the conversation is getting a little bit meatier now. Can you define what 150% AMI is in numbers that people will understand, that, because everybody kind of knows what they make a year, but 150% means nothing. No one has the table or the formula in front of them. So can we define that as we have this conversation? What's 150%? What is 20 to 60%?
Yeah.
What are those income numbers?
I wish I had that as a supplemental slide. I'm sorry.
First question,
almost
you
always
do,
do.
okay, but we're talking about it and people are listening to the conversation, and we don't know what that is without going through the reference chart. Can you define that off the top
Give
of
a
your head?
baseline now if you want.
Yes. Yes, I would rather look
So-
you in the eye, so I knew you wanted to talk, but go ahead.
Sorry about that, Trustee Agel. 100% AMI for a single person household is 91,300. So you can then do the math on all subsequent calculations from that for a single person household.
Maybe a
Just for-
financial person could
Go-
do the
I'll pull up the chart.
math, yeah.
Yeah,
Let's,
we can go to the
let's-
next, yeah.
Let's use the numbers for the terms we're talking about today. We've talked about 150% and 60%.
Yep.
Because what I hear, I guess I'll continue a little bit.
Yep.
What I hear is under 60%, we kind of furrow our brow a little bit and say, oh, that's going to be harder. But there's a lot of people in that neighborhood that need a hand. So I think that we have to figure out a solution there and not turf that off to somebody else. So answering questions while we're contemplating, I think we're still waiting for that number. The density, I think, is something we have to be considerate of, and allowing higher density. That Netherland development was 30 per acre. It didn't look it looked like an apartment building. It provided opportunity for people to have a roof over their heads and a safe place to go, probably in a good location to be able to go to a job. We don't have a great solution for that. So there's a couple of clarifying questions. I guess I'll go on and,
I found it right here.
yep, thank you. Oh, see, yep, charts.
All right, so this is Larimer County. This is the number of individuals in the household, and then this would be your AMI. So if we're looking at 150 and going across, household of 3, so 2 adults and a kid, 172,000 AMI. So that would be considered attainable housing in our definition right now.
Short of carrying this folded up in my pocket,
Yep.
where would I direct someone to say, this is where you're at, this is what percentage of AMI you are at, making $60,000 a year?
It oftentimes doesn't come up unless you're looking for support or programs, right? I don't think many people know unless you're looking for housing and you go to the housing authority and you say, I can't find housing and this is, our income. And I don't know how to answer that unless, having been in a situation where you're trying to access resources.
Where would I, right, but the conversation in town, I think, is much simpler.
Are you saying like where, what?
Yeah, I'm gonna get back to that, but I wanna kind of give some context to this, because the conversation downtown or wherever
Sure.
is, man, housing's expensive, man, it's a lot to live here. I wish I could get a hand with housing, or what's the housing authority doing? And I wanna defend as much as I want to provide information and have an intelligent conversation, to say that person making, say, $60,000, well, I know there's opportunities for you,
Yeah.
but I don't have this chart in my pocket. So where would I physically look to find this chart?
This is on the Housing Authority's website.
Okay.
And then I Googled Larimer County AMI, and it was the first thing that popped up.
Okay, good.
And that's how I was able to so quickly find it.
Good
And then
work.
to answer your question here, so this is your household AMI. So as an individual, a household of 4, I make X amount. So I'm, this is what my AMI level would be. And then when providing housing, so the housing authority, these are the AMI rental rates that would be at these various AMI levels. And so if we restricted a housing development, rental rates, oftentimes with LIHTC, you're looking at, 30% or so. These are your monthly rental rates that can't exceed those numbers for those restricted units.
If I could step in very briefly.
Yeah, thanks, Scott.
And yeah, you're welcome. I'll try to speak loud enough so you all in the room can hear me. The Manager Speedland did a good job of explaining what this bottom part of the chart is. And it is the rent maximums, that's the associated AMIs on the left-hand side of the chart. It should be noted that EPHA understands the unique situation that Estes workforce sits in, and that predominantly our wages are significantly less than most of our front range communities. And so we fall anywhere from about $130 to $350 less than these maximums, even though that is what we are allowed to charge under the LIHTC program rules.
So Fall River Village is an example where there's mixed AMI levels of income restrictions. So some units are restricted at 60% rental AMI levels, and some of them do go up to that 80%. But what we would consider market rate is 100%. And so then again, attainable exceeds what would be market rate to up to 150%.
So market rate, we're calling 100%. Attainable housing is 150% AMI.
Can get up to 150% AMI, because
How-
again, there's a number of individuals that, you know, are looking for a certain kind of housing, but is maybe restricted to the workforce. And so getting up to that 150% is appropriate.
And, okay, and then the last question, just to further define this little list, is affordable housing then is what level AMI?
To be determined. That is not something that we have defined at this point. One of the things that we've heard from this board when workforce housing projects have come to you is that, you know, maybe those rental rates aren't as affordable as you'd like to see. You'd like to see more workforce housing that has lower income or lower rental rates. Again, most of the workforce housing that we see, especially from private developers, are going to be closer to that market rate, simply because economically they have to do that. By increasing density or increasing the number of units, it fills that gap.
So that
they can have lower
So
rental
your
rates.
answer is good, and it kind of brings forth part of the conversation that I think is very important, is that the terms that we've been using for at least the last 2 years that I've been paying better attention to terms and how rules work, is that affordable housing is used interchangeably for so many things. And when people hear workforce, they think affordable. But we've been talking about this in this room. I've been talking about this for 2 years.
Yeah.
So we really need to nail down the definition and figure this out to meet the needs of the community. So I appreciate that you said to be determined, and I'm happy to participate in that decision.
Well, and the title of the presentation, right, is definitions, and yet that wasn't something that we actually discussed in this, because we're looking at, you know, general policy or direction that you want to see, and then formalizing those clear definitions based on the policy and direction we receive from today. So
Yep, I'm happy to be having this conversation.
great.
Just a quick question in addition. So running the numbers, it doesn't seem like you could have a development at 60% AMI, which is $1,436 per month for a one bedroom for one person.
Right.
And have 12 units and generate $206,000 a year and really have a sustainable investment in apartments.
It's not something a private developer would be eager to.
No, it doesn't seem feasible, especially with like a $625K per door development fee. There's just a loss. So I'm not sure how we can bridge that gap for developers, and I'm not sure it's our job to make that part of it easier. I do think, like Bill Brown said, that maybe that's part of our job as the city, is the supplement to create that type of housing for people within Estes Park that's subsidized a little bit by the funding that we get. In terms of the density the zoning, I'm actually not a huge fan of turning the accommodation into more dense housing, because I do think some of the accommodation areas that we have are more spaced out and are not very realistic for workforce housing. And we definitely, and you know, some of our zoning for accommodations is stretched throughout, you know, the Fall River corridor, and it may not be appropriate for each one of those areas to have like multifamily, those big dense housing areas. And it's just, you know, it's a case by case basis. This is probably not the right solution, but we may want to rezone it back to residential multifamily if we're thinking about doing accommodations, or we're thinking about trying to do that within the accommodation space. And I am a fan of increased density within that residential multifamily. I'm looking for a house for like 6 months, so I am very familiar with all the zones and you know, the residential multi, and we just have kind of a patchwork of that, and you know, there'll be a good plot that comes up, and it's kind of spread throughout the city. So you know, maybe changing the zoning in some areas would allow us some more flexibility with that. And I realize, you know, that makes it a little complicated with the 300. And then in terms of the density within that, I do think, you know, at least 12 is more appropriate than 8. And then maybe building up from there. Do you know how dense the wildfire development is?
I don't off the top of my head. I'm assuming it utilized the bonus at 16 per acre.
Okay,
I don't think there was anything in addition to that.
okay. Because that seems like a fairly dense area.
Steve may have a better answer to this. No.
Okay.
Well, I'm just going based off of memory. I
know.
don't think they utilized the full density bonus if you include the townhomes and single-family units. So they might have utilized the density bonus with respect to those workforce units that were multifamily structures.
There's condo complex, or yeah,
Okay.
in the middle, but then there's other, it was mixed. So there was other single family and townhouse and
Right.
Right, okay. And I think that height is as one incentive that we should be very careful with.
Yeah.
Especially in the outer areas that are not downtown. And that's it.
thank you.
There's no lights on, so I'll toss mine in quickly. I think I agree with Bill, let's not chase the lower AMI levels. Density, additional zoning districts absolutely should be considered, and I know this is not a decision point. We'll get to that decision point as to what those would be. The development incentive, I saw that 16, 18, 20 number quite a bit in the relative communities, and that probably is somewhere in that target, although I think I heard Trustee Mears say like 12, but there'll be variability, but when you come back with more specifics, yeah, certainly it should have more. And then additional incentives, sure, take a look, see what you got. Okay, there's mine.
Thanks.
I pretty much agree with what everyone else has said there. Certainly go to the other zoning districts and look at those, and what could be done there. I too am not comfortable with looking at the height.
Yeah.
We're looking at really as the character of the community. I think changing the height changes the character more than anything else here. I think we can increase, and we're talking about units per acre. So the density of the unit, or the appearance of the density unit, appears, the function we haven't talked about is the size of the unit. So 10 large units on 10 acres, or 10 large units on 1 acre is much different than 10 smaller units.
Absolutely.
So that the design criteria and how they work in the open space and how they work in some of the pictures you saw, they actually were very open
Yeah.
and seemed to fit the character. So fitting that character has a lot to do, not just the number of the units, but the size and type of the units, which we haven't really talked about. To me, though, the height is kind of the electrified third rail.
Yeah.
That's what changes the character of Estes Park if we start building 4 or 5 story buildings, and that would be hard to convince me to
That's
support.
aligned with a lot of the feedback we've already received from the community development. I wasn't really even supposed to bring up the H word, the presentation. However, it is a key factor in a lot of other communities and what they allow, and so it's relevant to the conversation. But yeah, the height, I think we've heard loud and clear from the community what their expectations or understandings of the height and the character of our community, how that should be represented. So, and then I also wanted to mention, you're spot on when it comes to, that Netherland example that we presented was primarily 1 bedroom and studios. And so that's how they're able to fit that kind of density there. So as, projects come through the review process, those are all things that are taken into consideration.
I just have one very minor thing to mention. When the community talks about housing like this, they tend to think of the people working in the restaurants, the people that are cleaning the bed and breakfast and the VRBOs and things like that. But we also have a very major contingent that would like to see ownership, particularly the teachers. You see this all the time. They move up here and they have to be in an apartment, but they want land, they want a place for a dog, for the kids to roam. And so I think it's really important that we keep focus as much on, and that's why AMI bothers me a little bit, because you're talking, those people are going to have higher AMI, but it's really hard to find a way to buy a house too. And we need to keep that focus on that aspect too, because that is a big core of our community, the the people that work for the town, the housing, or the school district, the hospital, all of those people need housing too, and a lot of them have to, I know my physician for many years commuted up from the valley as a physician because he didn't think he could afford up here, and he's since moved down to the valley because he's got better opportunities for that. So that's a segment of our community that we really need to maintain focus on as much as these low AMI issues.
Great, and I know we're running out of time, but I think also understanding that the Housing Authority provides income-restricted, low-income housing, right? And I think it was like 75 to 80% of the households that are in income-restricted housing are part of the workforce. And providing low-income housing, a lot of people are paying rents that exceed what they should be, right? So they may be paying higher rents. And if we add housing to low income or middle income, it's allowing movement for the entire market. And so that's really important too. We have a very high percentage of just house burdened, I think that's the term, housing cost burden, households within our community. And so allowing for that movement is really important. All right, so I think we have some clear direction for the four questions here. We'll have some conversations with private developers as well as look at, what that density, that base density increase what may be appropriate for our community, and come back with some examples, policies.
Okay, good. Thanks. We'll take 5 minutes offline here to run around and everybody grab their little bags and everything in. So we'll be back at 6:06.
I don't know how to log out.
Okay. Okay, we're back. I think we have the final topic on the agenda for the study session, draft code amendment for neighborhood meetings, and Director Correggia.
All right. Mayor, trustees, this item, neighborhood meeting requirements. And this is part two. Back in May, we had a discussion on the neighborhood meeting requirements that the town has for development applications being submitted to us. And back in May, we went over a quick overview of those requirements. And at the end of the meeting, trustees directed staff, come back, bring us something to look at, react to based on your direction. So again, just a quick overview. Development code does set the requirement for neighborhood meetings. And it is an informal conversation between applicants, neighbors, community stakeholders. And it's done before any application is submitted to the town. And that meeting is usually held generally accessible location after 5 p.m. on a weekday or any time during a weekend. Again, the whole purpose is to get people together so you make this meeting accessible. The applicant is responsible for all the logistics associated with the meeting. And staff can attend, but it's not a requirement. And if staff does attend, it really is kind of a observer type role, can offer some thoughts on process, but again, not part of any negotiation or discussion. The applicant is also responsible for submitting a meeting summary after the neighborhood meeting, and that's required to be submitted with their development application. So if that's missing, then the application is kicked back. Please go get that, submit that to staff. And once staff gets all that information, for the neighborhood meeting, we do place that on the website. So that is accessible for those who want the information. It is on our website. So in looking at some of the direction provided by the trustees and looking at some of the communities along the Front Range, we came up with some draft language for your consideration. One of the first things was it gives the director the ability to waive or require additional neighborhood meetings. Right now, it is a single neighborhood meeting. You have that meeting, you comply with the requirement. This would allow additional neighborhood meetings to be added depending on if it was a very complex project, a mix of uses, or if staff determined that there could be adverse impacts, well, maybe then we need a few more neighborhood meetings. We've kept the applicant as responsible for meeting coordination and taking care of all notice. We've retained the applicant as the meeting moderator. We've retained staff attendance as optional. We did change and clarify and added to the meeting summary requirement, specifically details on what were the issues discussed at the meeting, and then applicant, how do you plan to address those issues, or how do you not plan to address those issues? So we'd like to see what was discussed, and then if the applicant can mitigate any of those concerns, or if for some reason they're like, no, we cannot, and these are the reasons why. And depending on the information provided in that summary to staff, we've added another provision similar to the first one, where depending on what's provided, the director could say, there are some outstanding issues here. We would like a follow-up neighborhood meeting. That'll be a requirement before you move forward. So that is within the draft language that was presented to you tonight in your packet. And again, advantages, again, anything to increase community involvement, neighborhood involvement is an advantage. Some of the disadvantages, and we touched on this last time, if we require more neighborhood meetings, then that is more time added to the development process. And also, again, the second bullet, we want to make sure our expectations are clear. We're not creating a situation where development projects, it's a popular vote. We still have the development code that needs to be followed. we still have the decision-making body, the trustees, let's say, they have the ultimate authority to decide the decision. So we'd need to be clear as we move forward, our expectations in this process. But with that, Mayor, that kind of concludes what I would like to say. I'd be open to any direction or thoughts the trustees might have.
Can you go back to the slide with the potential new directions? Yeah. The proposal. I think in some ways we're heading in the right direction there. I'm not quite sure I see it reaching quite to where I'd like to see it reach yet. I would like to hear comments from the other trustees, and so Trustee Brown.
So, Mike, first I got a question. When could you envision you thinking it appropriate to waive the neighborhood meeting? Because that has been common in other places as well. When does that happen? Any sense of why you would do it or when that would happen?
Mayor, trustees, past experience has been if a request is so, the scope is so narrow, it has no, you can see the project and you can see that this only has internal impacts. There's no impact to the neighborhood. That would be an instance. I don't know if we do not have those type of, a lot of development applications. I don't know if that would be a condition for us to waive. The example we used last time where I could definitely see it being important was when you have a repeat application.
Oh,
They
yeah,
went through the process.
Like we had with Valley Road.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Okay, and then I had advocated earlier for a meeting that preceded, a neighborhood meeting preceding the pre-application. And I got a question on that, first of all. Typically, if you've got a development proposal, with the pre-application, how much information and work has the developer got to bring it up to the pre-application level? Is it, will they have drawings, for instance, of the proposed building? Will they have done any engineering studies of the soil or anything like that? I mean, if it's totally informal and it's none of that, my feeling about having a pre-application meeting might be different. But if they're actually going to a fair amount of work just to bring the pre-application to you, I'm wondering if there could be a benefit, and maybe we make it optional anyway, because it's kind of to the benefit of the developer to maybe do a pre-application neighborhood meeting to sense, what's going on in that neighborhood and how that might apply to their thoughts about development, and it might change how they go about doing it. But I'm not sure we should make it mandatory, so I'm kind of going around on that, but I'm really curious, basically, how much work typically goes into getting to a pre-application meeting.
Mayor, trustees, I will try to answer that question. It's a good question based on past experience and then what I've seen here. Initially, talking about the pre-application meeting itself, we'll get a call. Someone will call the planning office. I'd like to do X, Y, Z on this property. Okay, great, come on in for a pre-app. They could say at that time, I don't really have any plans drawn. I just would like some information. And so we meet with them, but we don't call it the pre-app. We'll meet with them, here's general information. What we do tell them is the benefit of the pre-app, the more information you provide us, the better we can guide you with information from our codes and the different disciplines that are there at the meeting. So the more information you provide us, we don't require engineered plans, but if you want to draw something up, that's more we can react to. In those applications that we can tell are either significant or they would have an impact, we'll always encourage there is a required neighborhood meeting. However, it does not hurt your cause to meet earlier. This would be informal. You would still have to have a formal neighborhood meeting, check the box, but you can always have as many informal meetings with the public, and we always encourage that. Not everybody takes us up on the offer, but we always encourage that.
Okay. So the answer is, as I would expect, it depends, right? And sometimes it's just to help guide the developer on what requirements they're going to have to deal with, in which case, you know, I presume the developer hasn't done a whole lot of work on it. But if it's a bigger scope thing, they might come to you with a whole lot of stuff to, and they may be interested in your reaction to it, and that's why they come with all that. But I don't know, I just think that the problem, and I like the idea that you can call for a second neighborhood meeting if need be. And I just think people come to these neighborhood meetings and they often don't have much of an idea of what really is being proposed until they come there. And they don't necessarily have a reaction immediately on the spot. They may want to think about it a little bit. So the benefit of a second meeting is you get a thing of processing it. And then I think I got this right, but you are having the developer put together the summary of the comments and the reaction that they have to the comments, right? Having said that, it seems to me that it's helpful to have staff there to evaluate whether they're really capturing what's going on. I do agree that should be no role for moderating it, but having staff present at a neighborhood meeting, I think can only help contextualize what is going on there. And I think it would be helpful for all concerned. So I hope we can continue doing that and get staff doing that. So.
Thanks, Steve. This is good. I had a couple things I wanted to talk about. One, I agree the staff ought to be there, somebody from the staff, really as a liaison and just to take notes and kind of as a second set of ears there. So we're not just depending on the notes from the developer of what happened at the meeting. I just would be more comfortable with that. But I also feel they should not be a participant or offer ideas or things. That's not the time or place. I like the idea of you having discretion or the director having discretion to either waive meetings or add more. I don't want to just kink the pipes and put in more bureaucracy and have meetings for the sake of having meetings. We tend to talk about things because they're projects with higher impact and ones that are more controversy, and those are the ones that float up to the top. What we don't see is all the ones that smoothly went through on the bottom and just everybody's fine, it went well, good project, the neighbors are fine, it went through without any issues. To force them to do all these kind of things and jump through these hoops, there's no value added, you know? It doesn't grow corn, as I like to say. So I think, I trust you that you would be judicious in waiving any type of meeting requirements like that. But in those cases, I like the idea of you having the authority to do that. Like I said, I don't like having meetings just because we're having the meeting because the rule says we should have the meeting. I do have a question. This might be more for Dan. As I look at this, these would not be considered public meetings under the open meetings law because it's not his decision-making body. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So what I don't want to do is for a developer or anybody to have the ability to limit the attendance or limit who's there, because technically it's not an open public meeting, and saying, well, we'll have a public meeting, but it's only for the people within 300 feet. And if you live within 305 feet, I'm sorry, you're not welcome to come to this meeting. I think we should spell that out. Maybe we even say, this is an open meeting to all the public. There can be no restrictions. And the other thing I think we ought to just flat put out there, these should be open to the press. I think that it's just to head off the problems we might have of having meetings and having the press thrown out of a meeting. Starts everything out on a bad footing. It gives some negative implications to the project and there's a lot of people may not be able to attend and would like to read about an article about it later on. I know some people are uncomfortable having the press at meetings. I think it's appropriate for them to be there. And rather than having to face that later on, I think maybe explicitly saying in our policy, these public meetings shall be open to the press as well, unless somebody feels differently on that one.
Well, Trustee Lancaster, personally, I would deal with that by saying that they're open to anyone. And
Anyone,
that would
that's fine.
include members of the press.
Yeah, but I just want to make it clear that the developer could not prohibit the press from attending. I think that was all of my comments. I think it looks good.
My comments reflect both Trustee Brown's and Lancaster's on. I brought that up last time that I do feel like staff should be in attendance, and I agree though they shouldn't moderate, they shouldn't produce the draft of the notes and that, but I feel like it's important to gauge both sides, both the developer side and the community side, and to have that feedback, and I think that would be helpful, you know, as a staff works through things too, to have that firsthand experience of what went on. So I still support having staff in attendance. And I'm just curious, would, you know, a development, more than likely going to be a small development that has no variance requests, you know, meets all the zoning requests, all that type of thing, is that typically where you would consider not having a public meeting? Because I've seen those come before and still blow up. So I'm just curious. So,
Mayor, trustees, I doubt there would be many instances that I would waive a neighborhood meeting. Probably the only instance would be if they already had one from. What we do have is projects that come in multiple applications. You may have a development plan or preliminary plat and maybe a variance. Okay, we're not gonna have 3 neighborhood meetings. We'll have 1. You'll cover everything. So, but technically the code would say you need to have a neighborhood meeting for each of those applications. So in that instance, I could see a waiver for those applications, but they still had a meeting. The 1, we just did not require 3. And then Trustee Eshelman, I guess I should offer my past experience is staff always attended a neighborhood meeting. It was interesting to see that here, that it was optional. Many other cities that I've seen also require a staff presence for those reasons that have been stated already. I think that is something the staff usually go anyways. I don't think that would be a burden to us.
okay, all right, thank you.
I agree with having someone present to make a recording of both sides of the conversation and provide perhaps a perspective from the planning department if that's helpful technically. What is I'm trying to get to the spirit of this, and I think what I hear from people is that they're interested in the earliest possible time that they can find out about a development coming, so they can do their own due diligence and check out what's going on or what's coming to their neighborhood. Can you tell me what the earliest time that someone in the public could find out about a development, details about a development easily, not by doing a core request or persistently bothering you with any new developments this week? And I know that a lot of applications and projects are listed on the website, which is very helpful. There's no requirement to ask questions. You can just look and see what's going on. So what do you think is realistic for the earliest general public notification or listing on a website to say something is coming to the neighborhood? Is that the process as it exists? Or is there an earlier time, say pre-application, or is that jumping the gun?
Mayor, trustees, that is, part of it is a dilemma that we do face in community development sometimes with development projects. Usually, in a larger town, you would have an integrated economic development function. They would usually be the first to get wind of a new project coming in. Unfortunately, a lot of times, community development, we find out sometimes just as the public might find out on a project. I have an idea for this property. I'd like to develop it. I have plans. Okay, well, you need to have a pre-app, and you need to have a neighborhood meeting before you submit that application. That can be on that case-by-case type of project. That is oftentimes what community development faces. We're in that same boat as the public. We do get the early communication sometimes for the larger projects, and those we do try to work with to get the word out early. As soon as we get wind of a pre-application meeting, we'll put that on the website.
Okay.
As soon as they say we want to hold the neighborhood meeting, we'll provide them the sign, we'll put that on the website.
Okay.
So we do try to put that information on there. Again, though, that makes the public, you do have to initiate. We have been exploring an email list. We found that we haven't used it in a while. We're testing the validity of a lot of the email lists. I think we had about maybe 250 or more emails who subscribe to planning's subscription list. So we're trying to see if we could utilize that. Anytime we got a new application, we could push that out there. Could that cause problems, people getting too many emails? Yes. So we'd like to discuss that process a little more with staff, but that is something also we're considering.
Okay, all of that was extra, but I appreciate that you are saying that as soon as you have something solid, the community is able to access that on the website as it exists today. Also pleased to hear that you're looking into that subscription list or potentially something that's proactive from the town to the community to say this is coming. But as to your question, I concur with the other input that I think having a staff person is important to the process to get good information.
I'm a little bit in the minority on this, clearly, so I'm not gonna go to war over it, but I'm happy with staff being optional but encouraged. I think, just as you said, that it behooves them to go. I think it's good information for them to absorb. I just think I appreciate what you've included here about keeping it very clear that staff is not responsible for setting up the meeting, for providing the summary. And I think you mentioned this, but I also saw it in the red line copy that, they are not responsible for speaking on behalf of the department. And I think I feel very strongly about that, not because I don't trust our staff to speak, so knowledgeably and expertly about things like this at a meeting, but because the purpose of the meeting is between the developer, the applicant, and the neighborhood. It is not a time for the neighborhood they are meant to engage together, in my opinion, and not necessarily pin a staff member who maybe, without their resources technologically or, other experts in the office So I feel really strongly about the applicant being in charge of it all. And I appreciate as well that there's the inclusion, and I can't remember if this was a carryover or if it was an addition, that any attendee of the meeting can contribute a summary. And their comments, I think is what I had seen in there, their comments about how the applicant, it's not just that the applicant is the only reporting party, that there can be another perspective included. And I think that's the point of these meetings, is the applicant and the neighbors. And I'm happy that you've kept that spirit in these revisions. One question I had, maybe for Attorney Kramer, but it might be for Director Crutchie as well, is if, from a legal standpoint, if staff or the board feel as though the neighborhood meeting isn't conducted according to these guidelines in the development code, these requirements, is that grounds for rejecting an application, assuming it made it this far? I mean, it's pretty you have to hold the meeting, and here are the things it has to be around this time, but is that so cut and dry that the board or staff could say, you didn't do this the way you were supposed to, so it's not moving forward?
Mayor Pro Tem, I'm happy to take a crack at that, but I think it might be more helpful first to hear from Director Corecci about how you handle that when it comes up. If there are complaints about the neighborhood meeting not being up to snuff, how do you address that?
Mayor, trustees, one of the most common complaints I've heard was there wasn't proper notice. So that was one issue that I've seen come up quite frequently, and not purposely, but just something inadvertently happens. We would have them start over. You have to renotice properly, hold a new neighborhood meeting. If they, for some reason, submitted their application, they were ready to submit, but they left off the summary, we would flag the application, it's on hold, you need to provide the summary. If there was a summary lacking, that would probably be one of the first comments we would make to them. You did not address XYZ in your summary, you need to provide a new summary. Whether the meeting itself was moderated correctly, that would be on a case-by-case basis. I'm trying to think of an example, but I don't know if I have kicked one back because so-and-so did not talk or this issue wasn't discussed. That would be something we'd have to look at.
So to follow up, Mayor Pro Tem, and thank you, Director. I think that's basically how it works most of the time. If there's anything that goes awry, if there's anything that's a significant enough problem with a neighborhood meeting, then Director Corecci can kick it back to the applicant and say, do it over. And I'm trying to remember if that's happened. I think that might have happened at some point in recent history. So that's almost certainly where it would be resolved. There is a provision in this draft and in the existing code that the neighborhood meeting shall generally comply with the following procedures. The spirit of that is if that something is just a tiny bit off and it's not a big deal, then you don't have to make them redo it. That's up to the community development director's determination. But ultimately, say the town board disagrees with the director and you think that the procedures were not followed in order to get that application to you, yeah, you all could reject that application. That's an extreme scenario because there have been plenty of process steps that have happened after that, that developer has been relying on and has been relying on the director's determination. But ultimately, yes, it's up to the town board to determine whether the policies, procedures, the development code has been complied with in getting that application before you and whether it meets those review criteria.
Okay, thanks.
A lot of people can write a meeting summary. You know, the applicant themselves, whatever discussion is had with the community members in there, and how they plan to address or not address certain issues in a meeting summary. That's a wonderful thing, you know, if there's 2 questions, 2 issues, or if there's 20. And that's one representative picture of what happened in that session. If the media happens to attend and publish an article saying, this is what we heard in the community meeting, great. Now you got 2 points of perspective. Having the staff member there, I think, really helps when it comes back home to the development department to say, now, wait a minute, they left off 2 things that were really key items in there, and it's, they didn't say whether they're gonna address them or not address them. Maybe they mention them in the media report, maybe there isn't a media report. Maybe some person from the community chooses to put a summary together and send it in to you and say, well, here's my meeting summary of what we heard. Does that match up with what the developer said? But having the staff presence there, I think, gives us that third point of contact, if you will, to if there are uneven or not matching statements of what's occurring. And then the second meeting, which sounds like, you know, you mentioned that you would rarely waive something. You know, however early that first meeting is, even before a pre-application, well, whenever, sometime before the actual application, that second meeting is the dialogue portion. That's the opportunity to say, I said I was going to address these, and I said I couldn't address these, and here's how that ended up, and we're about to do the application. This is the resolution of those particular issues. And again, the applicant may put it in a certain light, and certainly having staff in attendance or other representations of what happened in there will be helpful. And I don't want to create massive layers of that, but I do think the two meetings, the staff presence, those are things that really make it much more robust, make it much more likely that we get to closure on issues that are raised. Now, the one thing that we can't really manage, and the applicant has to manage in the moderation of the thing, is everybody going to be polite to each other? Is there going to be, are they going to operate like we try to operate in this boardroom, or is there going to be raised emotions and different kind of issues, particularly at the second one, the so-called closure meeting, where these issues were either addressed or not, but they were at least explained. That is something we'd ask for, but we're not managing that. We don't have staff there managing that and a professional moderator doing it. That will be up to the applicant to do that. But I just think that those two pieces are critical to what we're trying to do to make this more robust. Staff presence and a summary from them, at least to you, as to how accurate the other summaries are. And then a second meeting in almost every case. I can't envision something that had requisite simplicity that you would consider waiving. I can imagine that. But in the majority of cases, I think you'd want the two. So those are my thoughts. I think that kind of reflects a lot of what we were saying here in terms of staff. I know we had a different opinion on the staff aspect of it and the second meeting aspect of it. But those to me are critical pieces of making this more robust.
Mayor, there was a piece of that I think might be worth putting into the code, and that's that we expect attendees at these meetings, we're not going to police it, but we expect them to observe basic standards.
We should have that. There should be a statement like we have up here before the board meetings of what the expected behavior is.
Right.
From everybody.
And I don't expect that staff is going to stand up and say, no, that's not civil enough. But if we're going to say that anyone can attend and make that part specific, then we should say that there's a responsibility attached to that as well.
And no, staff wouldn't have any requirement to interject, just eyes and ears in there. But if they come back and they give you a little summary and say, whoa, man, that was heated. And here's what the 2 or 3 really hot issues were, and we got a challenge there. That I think that helps in managing the process forward. There is one other piece. I'm not sure how proactively. I know Trustee Eigel was asking about the communication of when this gets posted, and I know those get posted on the website at the appropriate time. But, the more proactive that announcement can be, the better. How many of these do we have a year? Not very many recently, We seem to have a stretch there in maybe 2024 where we had several, and some of them which turned into projects, some which didn't. But there's no magic number, but it's not like these are super voluminous numbers. We don't have 25 of these a year. We might have 2 or 3, maybe half a dozen.
Mayor, trustees, I think Mayor, you're probably hitting the number, maybe 6 to 10.
Okay.
In a typical year where communities along the Front Range might have 1 a week or more. I've seen that happen, but yeah, we do not have many.
Okay. Other input. Is that sufficient input to continue to work this concept? You have questions for us on that?
Mayor, I do, thank you. I do have two clarification questions. 2 meetings required. Was that a requirement or an encouragement based off of the scope of the project? That's a large project, we would then say there's a follow-up. Or was the board looking at a requirement for 2 meetings no matter the application?
At the moment, I still like the idea that there would be some type of lower-level project that you could waive that second one. If there was very little controversy, very little issues to address, I can see that. So a strong encouragement that on any significant development, and especially if there is controversy and discussion and a lot of open questions, yeah, 2 sessions.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. And this next one, Town Attorney Kramer had brought it up, a statement in the code about behavior and that it should be respectful. Would that be something enforceable such that if we did get a report or staff was there and we were like, this meeting did not go well, would we kick it back and then require another one? Or is this just an FYI almost, please conduct these meetings with decorum?
Well, there'd probably be a sense of scale. If something completely went off the rails and there were verbal bricks being thrown, well, yeah, I think things need to back up and appropriate feedback given. But you were asking whether, if it wasn't conducted right, Trustee Mayor Pro Tem, about whether it could be rejected based on having a meltdown or something like that. Maybe that's not what you were thinking. I was reading it that way.
Well, it was, if a neighborhood meeting, you have the applicant who says, I'm just like, here, I'm gonna talk and I've got, 3 minutes for questions in the end and then we're wrapping it up. Or vice versa, if there is, and this might be touch on some of the conduct where you have, community members who aren't allowing the applicant to do a full presentation or, either
Right.
side. So something that we feel like it didn't achieve the spirit of the
Right.
guidelines. That was the intent
Yeah.
of my question.
I think she states it best.
Just one additional thing, in the proposed copy, I think it's number 8, it says, upon review of the written summary and any responses, the director may require a follow-up neighborhood meeting or meetings should the submitted materials indicate outstanding issues remain that could benefit from additional discussion. Are you suggesting that it should be at 2 and that the director could waive that second one? Or
Yes.
do you think that that's sufficient?
No, I think it should be stated that we have a de facto second meeting, but there is an option in low-level, non-controversial, pre-app stage that he could waive.
I disagree with that. I like it as written, but that's just my opinion.
I share your views that I think the key is we give you the discretion to have as many meetings as are necessary and that rely on you to determine whether multiple meetings are needed or not. I do think it's a good thing to recommend to a developer that they have a meeting very, very early and maybe even before the pre-application. But I just think we've got to invest and use some discretion as to how that's done, because you've got to allocate your resources to, if there was a flurry of these, you might, need to manage staff even on that point. But I like the idea of giving you the discretion as to whether to waive or add additional meetings.
I would agree with that. Simple.
Good?
Mayor, trustees, thank you. Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We'll move on to any future study session items. Travis?
Mayor, one
welcome
from
back.
staff. We would like to come back and talk to you about the facade and sidewalk improvement program proposal. We discussed that as part of the efforts to support small businesses in town. We'd like to add that to approved unscheduled.
Okay. Trustees, any items to add?
I would like to just request, I know there's a couple of us that are new to the board, and just get a little bit more familiar, have some discussions on the fish hatchery property to get a little bit more in tune with that and have some discussion over it, not just necessarily history, and then also like concerning other housing authority acquisitions along those lines. Just some general discussion, and I don't know if it needs to be a study session agenda or just a discussion item in the regular meeting. Open to that.
I accept that.
Okay.
I'm seeing nodding heads, so.
Mayor, for that one, would work with Attorney Kramer to make sure we stay within the bounds of the
Right.
quasi-judicial nature. There is
Absolutely.
but the history of that project, I think, the history of the town's efforts there are probably something that we could go over with some guardrails.
Right, I'm not familiar with the current timing plan for that. It might be that the opportunity to have a conversation about that is when the application comes in front of you all, and then we wouldn't have to worry about the quasi-judicial issues because we'd be at the hearing. So it might depend on, I remember having a conversation a few months ago because there was a presentation on the fish hatchery, I don't know how many months ago it was now. And I think the thinking at that time was, that's the last one before the application comes in front of you all. So I need to check with them on timing.
Yeah, the timing, I get the sense that we might still be a ways away from the,
If the board would authorize the study session and/or a report and discussion item, staff can work and figure out, okay, how does this
Yeah.
slot in with the existing time frame and what's going on? And then bring back either that or, hey, we don't need to have this, it's gonna come forward quickly. I suspect it'll be the former.
sure. And yeah, Town Attorney Kramer, definitely give us the guardrails on that. Trustee Eigel.
Mayor, we talked about, do you remember that conversation about the Valley Road property that was rezoned and et cetera and henceforth? And there were some opportunities, I think, for the town to make a gesture that would right some wrongs that had come up over the years and potentially been some type of a hardship. I would like to have a conversation about whether this board is interested in prorating a refund of the fees that were paid for a certain zoning and then the zoning changed. And for us to keep that full year of 3 licenses, I believe that is accurate. 3 licenses on that property. There is not a policy, and it is not the town does not make refunds on fees, and usually, and it would be an action of the board to make that gesture and that refund. And I think that it's in order. I think it's reasonable, and I hope that this board would hear maybe the logistics of that. If it's appropriate, this board can talk about it in public and make a decision on it. So that was my long description of, can we refund the fees to that owner for that property?
Your magnetism created nodding heads on both sides of you that I was watching.
Okay, well, I'm looking at you, so I appreciate you telling me what they're doing.
Is there another nod?
Okay.
It seems we have sufficient
And this is not,
consensus.
yeah, we're not saying we're gonna do this, but
Yeah.
we need more
To
information
discuss.
to decide whether or not, yep. So would that be a board meeting agenda item? Would that be a conversation? Can we drag this out for a while and have a talk about it and then have a board meeting about it? Or, you know what I'm after? What's the
Trustee
best way
Eigel.
to handle?
Since that might require an ordinance,
Yep.
we might want to have a conversation about it before we draft an ordinance. Unless the board just wants to instruct me to draft an ordinance. I see a head nod, I see a couple head shakes.
I would be in favor of that, and then we can have a discussion. That might be the most efficient way, the efficient use of your time. If you were to draft that, knowing the spirit, having sat through the conversations, then we can talk about it and make a decision. I don't want to belabor it, but I think it's the right thing to do.
Is that the right order then? Does that work?
That's entirely up to the board. The board can have a conversation and then direction, or the board can give direction now and then have a conversation.
Well, it'd be nice to have a draft, I think.
Attorney Kramer, oh, unless I'm giving it up. So I was going to just say, Attorney Kramer, would you draft a resolution that we can have a conversation about refunding the fees to the property owner on Valley Road, recognizing the change in the zoning and the use of that property and the prior issues with that?
Trustee Eigel, I'm happy to figure out what that would look like. My only hesitation is that I see head nods and head shakes. And I
Okay.
don't know how many of each there are.
Okay, I'll let it go at this
I think
point.
we better go to discussion first, yeah, and see where we want to give direction. I think I'll save mine for the next board meeting. I have one that is not urgent that we need to discuss in the winter. With that being said, any other topics? It is 6:54. This study session is adjourned. We will be back at 7 sharp, so in 6 minutes.